Yes. Welcome to our last panel for the GFF conference this year, believe it or not. It's on contemporary science fiction fandoms, and we have two talks in this panel, one of them by Christina, one of them by Ashumi, and then we're gonna hopefully have a nice discussion about fandom right after. So without further ado, we're going to hear from Christina Wurst on the rise of Skywalker, social media, fan response, ideological discourses in online fan communities. Take it away.
Yeah, that was a really unworldly title. Okay, first of all, I'm very happy and excited to be here because it's my first conference paper, and I'm so really glad this is still happening in some form after all. And also it's really cool that all of these are being recorded. So also thanks to all the organizers for making this happen. First about me, I'm usually a teacher for grades 5 to 13 by day and doing my dissertation at Uni Tübingen on the side. I was kind of fascinated both by modern online fan culture as well as the role social media plays in political movements and phenomena today. So I ended up with a thesis on the borderline between fan activism and toxic fandom and the role ideology plays therein. So why do I look at fans instead of the work itself, and how does this relate to contemporary political issues? Popular culture such as Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker is a place where hegemony is negotiated, and many fans are often acutely aware of this and use it as a platform to advocate for political issues, not just in explicitly activist efforts such as campaigns for better representation, but also in everyday practices. In the spirit of the good old slogan, the personal is political, seemingly trivial matters such as preferred relationships can form the basis of ideological fan activism, as is often the case with slash shipping, for example. One of my case studies is the social media, particularly Twitter discourse surrounding the Star Wars sequels that came out between 2015 and 2019. Of particular interest to me was how shipping was politicized and what a rhetoric mirrored the ways in which mainstream political issues are discussed nowadays. For those unaware of the new Star Wars or its fandom, a brief recap of the canonical situation. Protagonist Rey is threatened and attacked by antagonist Kylo Ren several times in the first movie. Nevertheless, many fans immediately imagine a possible romantic relationship between those two enemies. Enemies to lovers is quite a common trope in fan fiction. However, in this case, it caused a lot of controversy in Star Wars fandom, creating two factions that conflict with each other. The so-called Reylo shippers in support of such a relationship, and the so-called antis opposed to it on the basis of it being an unhealthy relationship, which to some degree also echoes the anti-fan activism around Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey, which was similarly rooted in feminist ideals and outrage over the glorification of a powerful, angry, abusive white man. This conflict was initially rooted in a debate over whether such a problematic ship was anti-feminist and romanticizing abuse. However, this quickly developed into polarized groups, with particularly the Reylo faction often the receiving end of death threats, bullying, and doxing by the antis, even if they didn't argue in favor of the relationship in question, but were just casually involved, for example, by liking fan art. Yet on the other hand, they themselves were often legitimizing any criticism of the relationship or the character of Kylo Ren as anti-behavior, and hence not worth entertaining, even if, for example, racist fan behaviors were pointed out. These labels were therefore often not self-identifications, but assigned by the other group. As many fan studies scholars, such as Lori Morimoto, have pointed out, fandom can to some degree be seen as a microcosm of society at large. Hence, the way these fanish disagreements evolve into polarized factions might tell us something about how social media platforms change the face of political discussions nowadays. I agree with Benjamin Moffat that we need to rethink populism in an era of social media being better described as a political style than an ideology nowadays, as he puts forth in The Global Rise of Populism. Conflicts in such large fandoms reveal to some degree the mechanics, how dealing with large, to some degree faceless masses and limited interactions can encourage populist rhetoric on social media platforms. We can see quite a few parallels, but also key differences in such fandom conflicts. as, for example, stances of specific issues become conflated with generalized descriptions are attributed to larger groupings of people that are the threatening other, which then encourages in-group cohesion. They are Raylo has in many fan spaces become a shorthand for a person to avoid, even if the specific person is mostly posting about other fandoms or topics. On the other hand, any kind of disagreement related to the new Star Wars might be boiled down to they are an anti. In many cases, both parties tend to construct themselves as the unfairly attacked silent majority that speaks for the real fans, that truly understands the movies, both feeling at the same time validated and disappointed after the third movie, The Rise of Skywalker. As Rey and Kylo Ren kissed and he then died, no one truly got what they wanted out of the movie. Reylos felt partly validated because they picked up the romantic cues and read the text right. Antis because they were right that there would be no happy ending for the relationship, seeing this as the movie agreeing that it would have been a toxic relationship. Yet both felt that the text failed the true fans by pandering to the bad ones. A key difference here is, of course, that, oops, no, I scrolled too far. A key difference here is that there is no clear light to be criticized, with many scholars such as Jan Werner Müller see as a necessary but not sufficient condition to describe something as populist. The relationship with the powers that be is in many cases ambivalent. However, in my opinion, most important aspect, the sense of a people, is replicated and it both construct the opposing party as bad fans, which are threatening the community of real fans, either by endorsing fictional or cyber abuse. As Müller points out, populist claim to representation is not an empirical one, but is always distinctly moral. The way these fan groups consider each other a threat to the community for having the morally wrong stance on a fictional relationship kind of echoes the way certain populist parties and leaders claim to speak for the real people who are actually under attack and therefore seem like a smaller group than they are, while polarizing a variety of stances into a simple good-ass versus bad-damn dichotomy. These parallels suggest that similar factors such as the properties of these social media environments might encourage these behaviors. Okay, that's it so far.
Well, then thank you. And we're gonna switch over to Ashumi's talk on participatory culture and experimental speculative fiction. Go ahead.
So happy to be joining this quite last minute. I wasn't presenting in the original GFF conference, but since my thesis touches upon fandom, it only kind of made sense that I joined this particular panel. And well, to begin with, just consider, I've already talked about, all the generic proliferation of media in our everyday lives, and there's no off switch when it comes to media today, especially with, the guerrilla marketing and aggressive advertising techniques that media producers, employ. But when we specifically consider television, you have this extremely strong influence of the neoliberal economy when it comes to things like time shifting and binge watching practices, for example, because well, now since they're pushing for this whole globalization and the attention economy, self-representation, and the attention on these publicity platforms kind of matters. And so this gives birth to, your influencer industries and celebrity industries. And so the landscape of television is sort of now constantly changing because of this interconnectedness between all of these different industries, or in the Bourdieusian sense, you could even call them fields. So because of this, my thesis addresses the question of, well, don't we need if the landscape of television changes, then the landscape of studying or investigating television should also change to kind of accommodate charting the progress of where we go from here in the sense of television media, and this is not just about production, or it's not just only about consumption, because when you look at things like the transmedia theory, transmedia storytelling, you're caught up in one that the whole delivery in multiple media formats, and how the logics of these individual media formats seems to apply to the text to create, this text narrative universe. So there's that, and then there's this focus on the feedback loop as to how, in the Stuart Hall sense, the consumers can sort of influence the production, and the production then influences the consumption, that sort of a thing. We kind of need a more immersive and innovative approach to studying television, when you combine it with the whole time-shifting neoliberal economy, networked fields are integrating into television media. And so, especially when television media seems to get more intelligent, like intelligent in the sense that content itself is becoming intelligent, and producers of television content are kind of crediting their audiences in the Jason Mitchell sense to piece together the puzzle that is being presented to them. I mean, you wouldn't consider Christopher Nolan's recent movie Tenet as television media. It's visual media nonetheless, it's film. And it is assumed that you require a certain work, like cerebrally, to piece together the events of the film. And that sort of is happening with television, especially when you consider post-broadcast seriality, that no longer are episodes, self-contained units. That has been since the VCR age, since technology was augmenting when it came to television, this has been changing. And so the project addresses this need for a re-theorization of how to sort of have a more holistic, a more comprehensive picture of television, not just in the sense of content. Content is key, of course, but also on the production side, on the consumption side, and recently when it comes to also modes of delivery, modes of like sites of individual and collective production, consumption, and prosumption of media. This includes your social media websites, like Reddit, where you have community centered around television texts, around figures, around celebrities, forming and engaging in this dialogue. So it sort of moves into this, the research around television moves from research about the content to research about the meta-modernism that exists, the dialogue that seems, the meta-modern dialogue that seems to exist around television. And when you experiment with the television format, say for example, Black Mirror does with the Bandersnatch movie, where you have the whole choose your own adventure, and it's the viewer is sort of getting a little more autonomy than one would in a normal television text. That how do you choose to move how do you choose that the plot progresses? How does it move forward? You have certain choices, but at the same time, it's sort of a fallacy in the sense of, well, are you really getting as much autonomy as you think you are? Because those scenes are already shot, and at some point the narrative reaches a dead end. So in this sense, sure, ludic logic and the logic of gaming can be applied to, this whole choose your own adventure. But really, in the sense of examining a text like this, which is experimental, transmedia just doesn't cut it, especially when you consider delivery. This is not a theatrical release. So in the traditional sense, if there is a traditional sense, it's not a movie. It's a Netflix production, and it's a Black Mirror production. So it's a Black Mirror Netflix production. What does that mean for the text? And what does that mean for the audiences viewing this text? Because you automatically then associated it with Black Mirror, with Charlie Brooker, with Annabelle Jones, and then what kind of expectations they seem to have from a text like that, and then whether those expectations are met or not. So for this holistic approach, you need things like more than just, say, the autoethnography that is usually characterized in fandom-based case studies, let's put it that way. And another example that I could provide is the whole Doctor Who lockdown tweet along that was going on. Here, there's a hint of, you know, celebrity action because, well, because of the pandemic starting March 2020, when UK specifically went into this whole quarantine, isolation, social distancing thing, one of the producers of Doctor Who started this tweet along where certain key episodes were, she would watch them on Sundays and she would tweet about them, and each one of them carried a specific hashtag. So she invited fans, Whovians, to view those particular episodes at the same time and participate in this tweet along. And then eventually celebrities started joining the tweet along. So for the 11th April edition, they were doing the whole the Doctor's Wife episode, which is written by Neil Gaiman, who he is basically a poster figure already when it comes to literary celebritydom. You know, he's done Sandman and Good Omens and American Gods, and he cuts a quite familiar figure when you talk about the literary celebrity. So you've basically got this rock star presence, which is a loaded term in a sense, tweeting about one of the episodes that he's written. And then alongside, you've got even Michael Sheen, who although doesn't appear in the episode, he voices one of the alien characters. And then there's this interesting, you can kind of read between the lines about these casting choices, because there's this relationship you see between Michael Sheen, Neil Gaiman, and David Tennant when they came together in Good Omens. And there's a whole series of behind-the-scenes action that you can see on Tumblr and Twitter between Gaiman and his fans when he tells them, you know, feeds them little tidbits about what happened when they were shooting it, which sort of creates this impression of intimacy. And then there's this whole idea of shared casting or shared writing, where you have Gaiman writing that particular episode and Michael Sheen starring in it, and in a show which made basically David Tennant this everyday household famous figure. So this also kind of accumulates from the whole literary celebrity to shared casting and writing to this whole social media intimacy into the whole second screen effect. So you can't deny that all of these things are linked. And by second screen, I mean the primary screen, the first screen would be watching the TV show itself, the episode itself. That's your primary screen. And the second screen is participating in that, you know, real-time feedback about and tweeting with others who are watching it and people who are engaged in its production. So these kind of practices require an investigation that goes beyond the current theoretical tools that we have in media studies, and basically it pushes for it basically creates this exigency of you know, we need a more interconnected template of cultural studies, celebrity studies, fandom studies, media studies, all of it, to have this more holistic, more comprehensive view of what's happening in media as a subculture. Because you see through this kind of an investigation that media is a culture unto itself. It's governed by its own customs and principles and behavior, and that would enable us to mark its trajectory, its progression, and where does media go from here. Not just for because my thesis focuses on television media because I have to draw a line somewhere, but this could also help in terms of political fandoms especially, or campaigns, because that has an influence on, a direct influence on society. And it's key to examine how, that's what humanities does, right? We basically look into what humans are and what humans do as this imagined community. So that's what the project focuses on, and that's all I have for now.
Thank you. Here we are. All right. Christina can also turn her screen back on. So yeah, we obviously have a small group here today. So if there's any questions in the chat, please put them in now, or as we continue to discuss. I guess the first thing I've always done with these is just give the two of you the opportunity to ask each other something, perhaps, and draw kind of connections, obviously, between your projects. So let's do that if you have anything.
So you look into basically the political side of the fandom, which comes with this implication that fandom is political. And I would suspect this means more than simply in a gatekeeping sense, right?
Yeah, so there was just one case study that I chose for this conference, but I of course also look at, for example, Marvel fandom and also Doctor Who fandom. So, so I'm not just interested, of course, in gatekeeping, but also in all kinds of group dynamics. And also, of course, to some degree, in what you mentioned, also the way this changes the way the media is made, and also the way the producers engage with their fans.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not as much as a focus in my project, because I'm much more interested in how the fans interact with each other than with the powers that be. But of course, it also plays into this, because of course, a lot of motivation behind this fan behavior is because they want to change the canonical text, and they want to influence the direction they wanted to go in. So of course, especially my Raylo case study, I think, is a good example for this, because if you want to claim you are the true fans and the other ones are not the real fans and they need to be left out of fandom, they shouldn't get a voice. And for example, I know in the early times of the sequel trilogy, like 15, 16, after The Force Awakens, quite a few message boards banned the discussion of Raylo in general. It just said this is not allowed on our boards. And so, of course, this shows that there's a certain policing going on in which topics fans are allowed to engage in. And of course, by silencing the other half, you kind of also want to indirectly influence the producers to not engage with them, I think.
So in this, when you say you apply, say, the logic of groups and group dynamics within the fandom, would some of the practices show leaders emerging? Because in the logics of a group, there usually is a leader. But yes, I think it's more centered around the practice as being the leading practice rather than an individual as a leader, right?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. Usually you would have a leader, especially if I try to compare to populism. The focus in many populist studies and many texts from the political sciences is, of course, very much on the leader. And the followers are kind of sometimes treated just like mindless drones that agree with everything that, I don't know, a Gauland or whoever Americans does, or Trump does. So this is, of course, something we can't do in fan studies because there are no clear leaders. Of course, there are sometimes the so-called big-name fans that have a lot of followers and therefore have a bit more authority when they speak, but no one really claims that. They never really claim to speak for the fans. They may have a lot of people who agree with them, like their posts, but it's not a role they chose themselves, and it's also something that can change pretty quickly. So it's much more fluid, the structures.
But in the because you would, since in your example you relied on the Twitter discourse and presumably other social media platforms, wouldn't you read into the mechanics or the affordances of those social media, like on an interpretive level? Wouldn't you see those as emergence of leaders, like the more, because automatically the more likes or retweets or shares or comments you have, the higher the media website, the social media website itself places that post, pins it. And if it's pinned in that sense, that means it's this whole unspoken importance or leadership that the post receives. And so you as an author of that post also it carries forward to you as a poster that you are the leader because you could garner this kind of traction, this kind of attention. Wouldn't you read into that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think there are definitely people we could consider kind of opinion leaders that also, if they change their opinion on a subject, if they criticize parts of the text in some way, that this will also influence all their audiences. I just think there's a key difference in how far we can really call these leaders, because they didn't choose the role themselves. They are also only in some way indirectly by gathering a lot of views and likes or retweets, reblogs, whatever, put into this role, which they to some degree have little control over. And most of all, there's not just one figure like you have over political party, where you usually mostly just talk about the head of the party, but you just have a multiplicity of voices that speak for certain parts of the fandom. So that's a bit the difficulty in applying these concepts, because
so wouldn't you say that
kind of the same but also different?
Yeah, but wouldn't you say that, especially because you can't apply, say, the exact logic of a group or a group leader to this, wouldn't you say that we need a new vocabulary, a new way to theorize this, so as to consider that ABC principles of a leader apply and XYZ don't? So we can't call this a leader. We need a new definition, a new term that encompasses all the principle it entails, what it carries, you know?
Yeah, exactly, because I think especially if we want to use fandom as a kind of model for how we could talk about political movements in the contemporary media, then I think it's really important that we develop new vocabulary and also new theories to describe these group dynamics, because of course there are also a lot of political things going on that can't be described by party politics. I'm especially thinking of conspiracies for some reason. Because of course, if you have, let's say QAnon, if you have such a movement, there are also no true leaders here. There are a lot of people who just have a stance, a take on it, that becomes very popular. And they kind of, some people try to make themselves the leaders of this movement, others are put in these shoes. So I think if we want to describe something as vague in a way as conspiracy movements such as QAnon, then I think we could learn a lot if we had ways to describe these fandom movements.
Okay. Just one more thing, because you focus on, you talked about how the canon is always sort of in a state of flux, which coincides with the canon being archontic, and it's always being built upon, you know, it's this open archive. How would you say this reflects upon the collective of the fandom? So because the fandom, because the if the content is open to this kind of changes and influences and all kinds of things, wouldn't the fandom in terms of members of the fandom also be considered open, in the sense of there will always be an addition of new fans and thereby new types of fans? So there would be subgroups and sub dynamics within the groups, since it's constantly open. So it would open itself, for example, to gendered practices, to practices which are associated with sexual orientation and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. So this is also, if we stay with this specific case, that is also something I kind of felt bad about, because I described the fandom as polarized, but by simplifying it and breaking down to, yeah, I'm going to talk about the Raider group and the anti-group, I'm actively contributing to this polarization. And of course, to be able to speak about those two groups, I need to also treat them as if they were all the same and as if they were a homogeneous group, which of course is not the case.
Right.
So I'm kind of feeling bad about doing the exact thing I'm criticizing. But on the other hand, of course, if you want to talk about group dynamics, you need to make some generalizations at some point. So that's always kind of the dilemma if you study something as complex as fan communities.
Right.
Okay, if you have questions, that I also have some questions for you. Well, I'm not sure if that's something you thought about, because your focus is, as far as I understood it, very much on the audiences of media, so TV media and movie media especially. But I was just thinking about, because it's just something that just came up recently, because you also mentioned that these tweet-alongs are also I don't know the exact something, but you also mentioned at some point the connections or the parallels to political situations. And I was just thinking about how if there are any parallels and key differences between how, for example, debates are live tweeted because I'm thinking of it's not exactly tweet along, but a kind of tweet along to the Trump and Biden debate. And I don't know if you have any idea about how you could describe the similarity.
The funny thing is, I haven't followed the debate closely, but I see it because it appears on my Twitter feed as to what certain people think about it, which is interesting since you would consider the debate as the source text based on which they're tweeting about this. But simply by seeing those tweets and not seeing the debate, I kind of get an impression of what the debate might have been like. And this kind of an investigation would also kind of, you can tap into things like the meme culture, because there will be memes about something like this, you know. And so the kind of traction it's generating based on simply how big of an event, how significant of an event it is in itself as important as, I would say, the source event itself. You know, without that kind of traction, I think it would be a much different presidential debate than what it is. So in that sense, the tweet along, so to speak, is also political in a way that it is not just appropriation or annotation of the event. It literally has this significant influence on how people view that event.
I also think that's also a point in for your case, that we need new theories and new vocabulary to describe these these interplays between social media and events that are televised or streamed.
I mean, you can look into what Dan and Katz call the media events and what logics can be applied to the event. But once again, I feel like this theory is a little on the outdated side. It needs an update in the sense of how quickly the whole time shift in the post-broadcast era, you have real-time feedback, real-time meme culture, real-time exposition, and all of that. So in that sense, this whole media events thing needs an update. And for that, new jargon, new ideas, new theories, new vocabulary is necessary.
I've also been thinking about the examples that you used, of course, Black Mirror's Bandersnatch and the lockdown tweet along. Of course, those were events that invited the fans to actively participate, and were the powers that be encouraged these behaviors and were actively interested in it. Do you also look at the influence of audiences, live reactions, and also reactions after the fact, like, for example, reaction videos uploaded on YouTube, or just tweets that show up after episodes that did not actively try to engage with the audience?
So one of the key I look into a total of 4 case studies, and one of them is the OA. I don't know if you've already seen it.
No, but I've heard of it.
Okay, so on a narrative level, the OA kind of goes meta towards the end of the 2nd season. I'm sorry for the spoilers. So we need a separate paper which talks about spoilers in academia. And once that paper is out, I will not give out spoilers. But till then, so the 2nd season goes meta, and in a way that a lot of fans believe, or active audiences believe that this is a publicity event and the show is not cancelled. There will be a 3rd season.
I believe that. I want to believe that, mostly because especially how it went meta, but you know.
Right. And so you have on the immersive level, you have fan films being made. There is one film I talk about in particular, which is on YouTube, where they talk about how viewing this show has kind of brought the OA in their lives in the physical sense, and how they want to open up dimensions. And then this leads to this kind of performance of your fandom, in terms of they perform those movements which lead to those dimensions, and they want to jump into a dimension where this show continues. So with this meta-modern commentary or meta-modern criticism, I would say that this ties back, and because the actor, the director, the writer, they're all active figures on social media who are constantly in communication with the fans in terms of what they had envisioned for the show, what they wanted the fans to see or learn or imagine from it, etc. There is a feedback loop. There certainly is this whole back and forth between the producers and the fandom. But I feel like because this kind of a feedback loop exists, this is going to influence text in the future, where there will be more meta-communicative language, where there will be more real-time engagement invited, because this is a possibility now.
We have some questions, so I'm going to interrupt you there to interject with the questions. We also have thank yous for your extremely engaging presentations, but Julia wants to know, there's one for each of you. So to Christina, I'm quite foreign to Star Wars fandom, so I do not know the names of pairings, but the situation of toxic pairings is well, in the majority of fandoms, and aggressive reactions to certain type of pairings are quite widespread and well justified in many cases. On the other hand, it is creativity of fans and creative expression is supposed to be free. So in your opinion, how far is this aggression justified and how much of it is a political statement? Sometimes it seems more like an act of aggression and personal sympathies.
It's a question, because it's not something that I can answer easily in a few sentences, but I will try. So I've also been thinking about this quite a lot, because on the one hand, of course, I absolutely understand why there are reactions to such pairings, because I also refer to Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey, which were kind of the predecessors, in my opinion or my experience, of the strong reactions to the Reylo fans, because they also were very much influenced by this feminist idea that we should no longer support parents that glorify such power differences, and also relationships that are very likely to be unhealthy because of the also shared history between those characters. On the other hand, it's interesting that this only happens in some cases and not very much in other fandoms. Of course, there are many, many bad ships out there, and nevertheless, such strong anti-fan reactions only occur in a select few. So one thing I've also been thinking about is, why Star Wars? Why not many of the other cases? For example, a lot of people who share the Star Wars fandom are also Hannibal fans, and point out that Hannibal Lecter is a cannibal who tortures Will Graham, and nevertheless there is not that much of a reaction to it. So if we just use this one as an example, I think there are quite a few factors that play into this. One is, of course, that Star Wars is just very big and not just a niche cult show as Hannibal was. So of course, the more mainstream people you have in the fandom, the more likely it is that you have very strong oppositions and conflicts. Because, and also I think it's because it's a Disney movie, so you just have certain expectations, especially for the new trilogy, because it was in some way actively advertised as being more feminist. I mean, it was more like, we have a female protagonist now, and then people assumed it's kind of feminist. So it's not like actually Lucasfilm actively made a claim that they wanted to make a feminist movie, but a lot of fans just assumed that since they were trying for better representation, having a female lead, having people of color as the supporting characters or as the other leads, they just assumed that Disney would try to show more progressive ideology in these movies. So I think it's this mismatch between expectations and what I got in the end. Because if you watch a show like Hannibal, which is about, which has a serial killer as a protagonist, you kind of expect it to be fucked up. So you don't even expect a healthy relationship. But if you watch something like Star Wars, which is made by Disney, which tried to be more progressive in its new trilogy, you kind of have this expectation that they're going to do better and they're not going to repeat the same problematic tropes of relationships that we saw in Twilight, 50 Shades of Grey, in older Disney movies. And so I think because the movies did not deliver what the fans were hoping for, that's also something that contributed to these strong anti-feelings and this need to gatekeep and to kind of do what the movies didn't do and try to police the fandom themselves.
Thank you. And the question for Ashumi is, when fandom influence the industry and authors, it can be a very positive phenomenon, making contents richer and, as you mentioned, more intelligent, but are there also negative consequences of this influence?
So I should first give a disclaimer before I talk about my thesis. I have a very utopian vision of social media and what media can be. I would like to genuinely believe that media is being used for the good in most cases, but definitely there is negative consequences. Just the way internet has trolls and lurkers, although lurkers sounds more sinister than it actually is, because I'm a lurker. I'm somebody who would read everything that exists on social media but hardly engage or comment or leave a mark of me being there. But yeah, trolls exist, and even if you look into video game studies, there are the gender practices alone can be creating this super toxic environment, simply because you have people saying things like, this game was not meant for girls, or video games in general are not meant for girls. Usually in an American household, statistically, you will find that the video game console is in the room of the teenage boy or the young boy. It will never be situated in the girls' room. So it's ingrained in there, and you kind of need to challenge those discourses through the very means by which these are being propagated, so through social media itself. So in that sense, yeah, there definitely are negative consequences. This is what gives birth to, I think, polarized opinions and gatekeeping, which Christina also mentioned and addressed. So I would, and also in terms of content or feedback loops, this can definitely have a negative influence on how some people have, envisioned a particular character, a particular text to be, and when it doesn't meet that vision because the fandom reacted in a certain way, or because it was perceived or consumed in a certain way that it was not meant to be. So the whole idea of dominant or preferred meanings being thrown right out of the window, and that causing this kind of utter chaos, can definitely lead to, if not negative, consequences that one was not prepared for.
Yeah. I'm just trying to remember all the questions I had now. So maybe, yeah, because of to pick up on that, influence of what all of this influence of fandom changes. I mean, I think there's more and more claims that some things are fan service, and it's interesting that it's often thrown around as this is a negative thing, like we're giving the fans what they want. Sometimes it even seems like because of these claims that there's other productions that want to go into the opposite direction and just do something shocking and surprising to go against the expected and does fan service things. So I'm wondering if that maybe is one of the perhaps even negative consequences, because you're trying to be so edgy that you then actually alienate your fan base. I don't know if you have any examples for that. I'm trying to think of something.
I mean, if you think about the whole fan servicing thing, but then on the other end of the spectrum, you look at, well, not another end, but there's this side of the coin where you have fanboys who become auteurs. So you have, for example, Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, who grew up watching Doctor Who, or David Tennant, who grew up watching Doctor Who. And so they were fans in their own ways, and they even wrote fan fiction or engaged in things like all the fan practices that people do now. And then they become producers. So they jump over from the amateur transformative works to the professional transformative works side. So could you call that fan servicing? Once again, this is a need for a new vocabulary. Would you call this fan servicing when they, as fanboys, become auteurs and decide, this is the direction I want the text to go in, this is the direction I want the production to go in? And then when it seems to alienate the fandom, is it because it was deliberate in the sense of I wanted to alienate a fandom, or was it in the sense of I had envisioned this, I had so-and-so aspiration for the text or the character, and since I'm the producer now, it's in my hands now, I get to do that? I get to fulfill my vision, fulfill my dream for this particular text. So then is it still a negative consequence? And if it is, for whom? Is it a negative consequence for the production or for the fandom in the sense of how they're consuming the text?
Yeah, very good points. I was also thinking back to more of the gatekeeping practices, because obviously, so since you also do Star Trek, Ashumi, and then obviously, I mean, there's always a tendency to pit Star Wars and Star Trek against each other, which is bullshit. But just in terms of them still being like big franchises, and I mean, other kind of SF productions having gone through the same thing of kind of gatekeeping, fans jumping in now and saying you're not a real fan, which you also said, like Christina. So I'm wondering if you want to discuss that a bit more, because obviously with Star Trek, it's been this whole thing of like hashtag not my track, starting with Star Trek Discovery. I mean, basically even before, when the J.J. Abrams reboot came along, so many people were saying, this isn't Star Trek, this isn't my Star Trek. And then it got another heated wave with Discovery and everything that's come out since, basically. And I think with Star Wars, there's similar things happening, just because, you know, there's this fans are like, this isn't even Star Wars anymore, etc., etc. Ironically, in both cases, it's J.J. Abrams' fault, apparently. But yeah, maybe you want to touch upon that.
Oh yeah, I just start with this one. So I think there are lots of dimensions in which we could look at this. One thing that immediately comes to my mind is also the gender dimension of fan gatekeeping, which I think there's by Susan Scott, a great book about this, about how audiences still nowadays are imagined to be predominantly male, even though that is absolutely not the case. So because the assumed fan and target audience of, for example, Star Wars is still male, that was also part of an initial backlash against the Reylo ships, because people claimed Star Wars is not about shipping, this has no place in our message boards, and you're not a real fan. And I think this is also applicable to many other shows, that people still say, if you mostly care about the romantic relationships, you're not a real fan. Real fans care about the plot, not about their relationships, which still kind of devalues the mostly female engagement in fandom that leads more towards the transformative side, that leads more towards shipping and creative fan art, which is still not seen as a real fan practice in many spaces, and especially but not by many creators.
And it seems like, once again, this is where the direction in which the project goes, that we cannot ignore the delivery modes, because you have essentially Netflix and CBS All Access and Prime delivering Star Trek to you. And in that sense, because the show has, you know, been Netflixed or been Prime, that comes, these are loaded terms. It comes with certain implications as to what it means for a show to be Netflixed, what it means for a show to be CBS All Access. And on that, on a production level alone, invites gatekeeping from the fans, you know, that this was not what fans seem to, at least the ones who are saying that this is not my Trek, seem to have formed an idea or have an ideology of what Gene Roddenberry's vision was, based on the stuff he created when he was alive and the way it was delivered, the way it was produced. And so since all of that changes, not just that Gene Roddenberry is excluded, but that the way it's produced, the way it's narrated, the way it's delivered has transformed, where you don't have, for example, the opening boldly go where no one's gone before thing. It certainly becomes, oh, well, this has changed. This is not traditional Star Trek, so I guess this is not Star Trek. Yeah. So on the production side of things, also all of these modes of platforms and delivery matters. When it comes to Star Wars, I presume its Disneyfication would also mean the same thing for Star Wars in a content sense. A lot of people would simply say, well, now that Disney's producing it, it's not my Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, also this is the first trilogy where George Lucas is not involved in any way. So of course, we also have the same thing as with Gene Roddenberry, that people say real Star Wars is just the vision that George Lucas had. And even though he did have an idea for a sequel trilogy, they just threw it all out of the window and made their own thing. So people, of course, this is not real Star Wars, because they're still very much attached to the theory that there has to be one author behind all of this.
Yeah, and that's something that keeps coming up again and again, no matter what you look at. Like, I discussed with my students at length what happened to Game of Thrones, where all the criticism about the ending of the show was just based, constantly brought back to the idea that it's not George R. R. Martin doing this, and suddenly it's bad, basically, which is really, really interesting, because, I mean, the books have been criticized for so many things as well, especially when it comes to gender roles and all of that. But people always come back to that. Also, if only Star Trek done by Gene Roddenberry was Star Trek, the only thing that would be Star Trek is the original series, because he died after a season into TNG, and even the movies with the original cast, he has hardly any involvement in them. He doesn't write them, he doesn't direct them.
This would also raise questions of aesthetics, that these aesthetics are matching in a way or compatible to what Roddenberry did, and the newer aesthetics are slightly off. For example, a simple thing like we don't have red shirts anymore, in Discovery. So because this whole idiosyncrasy with red shirts doesn't exist, it's not my Trek.
Yeah. I love that.
And
never mind, also, Enterprise didn't have it either, or Deep Space, like, but it's kind of interesting. Like, I mean, a lot of the gatekeeping is kind of harking back to these wise old men that once upon a time created these things. And I guess
with Star Wars also, you have a certain format in terms of the movies, and then you have the Disney movies, which is traditional sense movies, but also delivered through Disney streaming. And then suddenly you're hit with The Mandalorian, which is again a different format and a different mode of delivery, and you're receiving it in a different way. So there is also questions raised on, well, I'm not going to subscribe to yet another streaming service, which means I don't get to see The Mandalorian because of, monopoly over distribution. Does that mean I'm not a true Star Wars fan?
By the way, this, because, I don't know if you don't know this, because you just brought up The Mandalorian, what was really interesting is when Star Trek Discovery moved to paid for streaming with CBS All Access, a lot of the claims against that were actually, it's against Gene Roddenberry's vision of a future that we now have to pay extra for this, which is one of the most idiotic things I've heard. But is it the same for The Mandalorian? Because, I mean, obviously it isn't, because you can't harken it back, but was there any people complaining that it's suddenly not available to every fan anymore because it's on Disney Plus? Because I don't think I've heard that.
I mean, of course there were personal complaints about I'm not going to pay for Disney Plus, especially after a lot of things that happened with Disney Plus, especially the fans that were pretty upset about what Disney Plus did to it's not called Love, Simon, it's the spin-off of Love, Simon. So when they said LGBT representation is not appropriate for Disney Plus, that upset a lot of people, and there are a lot of other things that also happened, that a lot of people chose to actively boycott Disney Plus for this reason. So of course they had their personal grievances with this, but actually it was quite the opposite, that a lot of people were like, finally we are getting real Star Wars again. So even though it was delivered in a completely different way, being a series, being made for streaming, being like behind a paywall in a sense, nevertheless they still were more open to accept this as true Star Wars than they were with the movies, which were in format much closer to the original was, and also in my opinion in storytelling and just the whole structure of the plot. In my opinion, they were closer to the original trilogy, which of course is also simply because they are movies and the structure of a TV show just has to be slightly different because of the long form content. But nevertheless, even though also, I mean, The Force Awakens was basically just a remake of the old movies. So even though The Mandalorian was quite different in delivery, in structuring, in all these dimensions, they nevertheless said this is real Star Wars, the movies are not. So that is actually quite interesting.
Then how does this tie back to the production in the sense of what makes it real Star Wars, if not delivery? Or so is it the aesthetics, is it the music, is it the idea that this is now once again cowboys in space, which means it's open migration for those who wanted Star Trek to be cowboys in space to Mandalorian now. So it's unbelievable the way this landscape is changing, not just in the sense of well, this is something different that we've presented to you, but in the sense of to what degree is that difference accepted and to what degree is that rejected?
Yeah, and may I just interject, because I've been asking myself the same question of like, if The Mandalorian is real Star Wars, why is it real Star Wars and The Last Jedi is not? And I think a lot of it actually comes back to representation and who's writing it, because Mandalorian is Jon Favreau, and I actually like his stuff a lot, but he's a white middle-aged dude, and he has a lot of cred with certain fans that look just like him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is actually probably a big point in why they like his stuff and they don't like The Last Jedi. And
particularly because you didn't speak about the whole sequel trilogy, but just about The Last Jedi. I think one big ideological difference is also kind of the way they view war, because of course the Mandalorian is like war is his whole thing. So there's a pretty heavy pro-war focus, while The Last Jedi had this whole criticism of the whole war machinery, of the whole system behind those interplanetary conflicts. So of course, I feel like The Last Jedi tried to be more progressive than the older movies, which of course didn't sit well with many fans who were just attached to the way the old movies were. And The Mandalorian just hits the right spot in a way that it just supports the same values that the old movies did in some dimensions, like for example their stance on war and using violence to solve conflicts. Because of course The Last Jedi had this line about I can't remember the word, but we don't win by fighting what we hate but saving what we love, which is just not exactly the right line if you want to see a Star War going on.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, since The Mandalorian is much more focused on the whole theme of solving conflicts through violence, I think it resonates more with the kind of old school fans.
This is the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it feels like a lot of and it's again brings us back to there is no homogeneous audience, because I think so many people pick on so many different things when they watch something, where you really have that phenomenon of like, did we just watch the same thing? Because in terms of gender, like I remember all the complaints about like Anakin and Padme getting love scenes, as if Han and Leia had never happened, and all of these kinds of things. Over Star Trek, when everybody says it's not political, and I only remember spaceships, and I don't know, like it's that whole different focus of how you watch something and what part of it is interesting to you and what you consume. And I think because of nostalgia, especially with something as old as Star Trek or Star Wars for that matter, people remember what they liked about it when they were little, and that's what they attach their nostalgia to. So if it's obviously vastly different. I remember watching Star Wars at age 10 and being madly in love with both Han and Leia. So that's what my focus was. But I'm sure there were many people that were like, oh, spaceships, space fights, I don't know, Darth Vader is cool or something.
But this is also an invitation to a new wave, which now grows up watching Discovery. So Discovery would probably be their entry, or Mandalorian would be their entry into Star Wars and Star Trek. So if that's their entry point, and at some point they decide, oh, well, in the sense of being a real fan, I have to watch the classic stuff, and then deciding, no, Discovery is Star Trek for me, TNG is not. So there will also be that kind of a reverse into what might mean what can be considered Star Trek or Star Wars for the individual and for the collective, especially when group dynamics come into play, that there is that certain group which grew up watching Discovery rather than grew up watching TNG, or grew up watching Mandalorian rather than the first 6 episodes. So in that sense, and I think we're running out of time, but at some point when we meet for coffee, we need to discuss Enola Holmes. Okay. In the sense of its fandom and all of that.
Yeah, Sherlock Holmes is developing into like a massive franchise, I think, at this point with all of these things. But I mean, the just to sum up, like the entryways are different is very much kind of the key thing also about transmedia storytelling, right? That we suddenly have people coming in via even obscure things.
Right.
So if there's nothing more on your ends, then we can indeed wrap this up here. And thanks again to both of you, and for those of you that joined us, and to everybody watching us on YouTube. And we're gonna, I guess we're gonna keep this online for a while. So even a few years from now, maybe people will come back to this and cite you as well. Guess. Anyway, thank you all. I'm gonna stop the recording.